So I thought since we were in the last week of the course that we should do a bit of a review of the major elements of this course. And these are the major elements really of historical thinking itself. And as you have been able to tell throughout the session, interpretation is one of the major elements of studying history and the major elements of understanding history. So this is what I mean by the interpretive value of history, that we know that history is not based on cold, hard fact. We know that history isn't based on absolute truth, that it's an interpretation. It's an interpretation of sources. It's an interpretation of events. And that interpretation is done by human beings. And it's a wide swath and variety of human beings who do these interpretations. And so it's really important to recognize history as something that is ever changing. And it is ever changing because of the fact that new people become historians and people with multiple and different perspectives become historians, and they start interpreting not only sources, and it's not only that they're doing new analysis, but that they start to interpret the profession, and they also start to interpret the tenets of the profession, particularly when it comes to historiography. So that's why the historiography is ever changing. We obviously have new ideas and new methods and new theories that come out. I always use the example of women's history, and that really coming out of the women's movement. But the bulk of the theory was created in the late 1970s and particularly the early 1980s. And then it started to be woven into the study of history. And that's where we've gotten all of these new illuminations about women's role in history and also the role of gender in history, right? So history is ever changing because there are new people coming into the field. They have very different perspectives, the new people that are coming into the field, but they also are just new minds. So they are going to be creating new methods. They're going to be creating particularly new theories, and that's going to keep history changing and changing and changing. So history is all about interpretation, and it has great value because it can be interpreted, because it can change. It doesn't have to be set in stone. We can always be doing better. We can always be looking at events differently, and we can always, and this is something that's extremely important, is we can always insert new perspectives into our profession. So again, it has great value to be an interpretive discipline, that things can change and that things are ever changing. I want you to make sure that as you leave this course, you recognize the fact that history is interpretation and it is not fact, that there are basic facts that you know about history. And I always use the example of John Kennedy's assassination to say that it happened on November 22nd, 1963. It happened in Dallas, Texas. But what else happened is up to interpretation, right? And that's what we do as historians. We interpret something, we look at documents, we look at a multitude of different sources. We use multiple theories. We use different methods for gathering and understanding sources. And then we put it all together. And so each piece of work that's done by a historian is unique. And sometimes we arrive at similar conclusions, but not always, and quite often we rarely do this. And it's those interpretations that really are what make up history and what are the historiography. And that historiography, again, is that canon of interpretations that have become accepted within the profession about a particular topic or event or field. And so historiography is really like our Bible in terms of the study of history, but it's something that continually changes, and the canon changes, and new interpretations are dropped in, and old interpretations, antiquated interpretations are removed. And so historiography, that ever important part of what it means to study a topic, to illustrate to your peers that you know what it means to be a historian and you know who has come before you in terms of your topic, that it's always changing. It's always going to be different over time. Talk about change over time, right? As historians, ever-changing historiography. That's what we're always striving for, is to make the historiography better and better and better. And one of the ways, again, I say that we can do this is by letting in more perspectives. And this is something that I hope that in the next 10 to 20 years becomes an absolute moot point, and we don't have to talk about it anymore, but it's still something that's there. Perspectives that were in the study of history 50 years ago are very different from what was there 20 years ago, and are very different from what there is now. But there certainly need to be more perspectives that are focused on and really let into the study of history. And we saw in the 1960s, 1970s, more African American scholars, and then we started to see more women scholars, and now we're starting to see more people who identify as queer as scholars. And so we need to continue to let these perspectives in, so that the historiography can continue to be fresh and can represent all of us. And so that's obviously what's really important right now in trends in terms of the study of history, is representation, and making sure that everyone is represented in a particular field. Everyone is represented not only in the narrative and the historiography, but also in the profession. So interpretation, okay? I can't stress it enough. History is not cold hard fact. It is based on interpretations that are created by historians who are using the tenets of the profession, who are using sources, and who are creating original research that will eventually, if it is good enough and if it is deemed to be something that really explains a particular event or issue, will be pulled into the canon of interpretations, which is our historiography. So the most important element of the study of history, particularly research, would be sources, right? And we've discussed throughout this course the idea of making sure that your sources are reliable, and making sure especially that they are academic sources. And you cannot write any sort of a research paper or understand really anything about history without consulting secondary sources that are academic in nature. And I always stress to students that you should always go to the historian first when you're studying history. So when you're looking for journal articles, when you're looking for monographs, you should be looking for the historian's work. And then you start to branch out. And then it's really no holds barred in terms of what type of an academic's sources and research that you can use. So it's any academic at that point: political scientists, art historians. It depends upon what you're studying, maybe social justice academics, criminal justice academics, right? Anybody who has has been minted with a PhD, okay, that has the credentials to be discussing what you are researching and what you will be using in terms of the secondary sources as your evidence. It has to be somebody that has the credentials, right? And we obviously know that sometimes we can stretch that a little bit, and we can go to people who are not considered academics, say particularly journalists, who are individuals who are highly knowledgeable, obviously, often highly intelligent, and they have the ability to give us information about especially more modern topics, that we can rely upon, right? But there are other people you can rely upon as well. I would say somebody who studies the history of law. Obviously, you would be able to rely upon a law professor or a lawyer. You don't have to be an academic to have expertise, right? But more often than not, you need to have an academic who has written the work that you're using as a secondary source. That you need to have someone who has the credentials, who is reliable, and who anybody who is reading your work can see that they are trained in the exact same methods, the exact same tools that you are as a historian. And that is very important. It's very important to see history as a professional group of people, a profession that has individuals within it who follow very specific tenets. And that's extremely important in terms of choosing your sources. Again, go to the historian first, then go to other academics. Sources obviously include primary and secondary when you are researching history and when you are writing. And we know that there's a wide array of both of these, right? So secondary sources, again, being academic, right? And they need to be journal articles, they need to be monographs, and sometimes they can be things like blogs, or as I like to tell students often, you don't use a documentary for a secondary source, but you can use the interviews with the historians embedded within those documentaries as secondary sources because they're the experts speaking, right? Otherwise, the documentary is at best tertiary. It is at best a reference. But if you're using the exact or the actual interview, then you can use that as a secondary source. So there are a wide array of secondary sources that are available to you, but not as wide of an array as there is for primary sources, right? So we've discussed this, the idea that, it's not just about documents, and that primary sources are not just textual as well, that it can be a song, it can be a piece and a work of art, right? It doesn't have to always be the written word. But in terms of the written word, in terms of text, you have you have diaries, you have newspapers, you have documents, you have documents that are governmental, like policies. You have, for somebody like me, political speeches. There are so many different sources that fit into the primary source category. The only major thing that you have to be dealing with in terms of primary sources is it of the time? Of the time that you are studying, right? So if you're studying the medieval period, you're obviously going to have a much more narrow group of sources, but there's still a wide array within that as well. If you're somebody like me who studies the modern era, and studies presidencies and studies rhetoric and things like that, look at all of the things that I could be going to for primary sources. I can even go to YouTube for primary sources because I can actually pick up speeches and not only be able to use those speeches in terms of the actual rhetoric, but also in terms of tone, and then also in terms of the demeanor of the person who's giving the speech, right? So such a wide array of primary sources that an individual can use regardless of the period in which they're studying, right? It just keeps getting, it's large enough when you're studying ancient history and medieval history, and it just keeps getting larger and larger as you move, particularly like me, into the modern era, right? So many, many, many sources. And again, never forgetting the fact that your research should be driven by primary sources and that the secondary sources are there to shore up your argument, that they are evidence for you. So what are you doing with these sources? Regardless of them being secondary or primary, you're synthesizing them, right? When you look at a wide array of primary documents about your topic, you obviously synthesize the things that you are learning in order to create an argument, in order to create an actual essay or journal article or monograph based on that argument, and you're just synthesizing all of that material. Then you bring in the secondary sources for evidence, and you're not only synthesizing the secondary sources with the primaries in order to make a coherent and cohesive piece of work that you're writing, but you also have to synthesize the secondary sources themselves, right? And sometimes that's done for you because obviously you need to look at a historiographical essay first before you start even doing your research. But more often than not, you found other secondary sources that you're going to be using that have not been contained in a historiographical historiographical essay, and you are going to synthesize those secondary sources and particularly their theses yourself, right? So synthesis really is one of the major elements of historical research. You have to find the sources, obviously. Finding the actual sources is a difficult process in and of itself, but it is the synthesis that is the major piece of work that you're doing when you do research, and particularly when you're getting ready to create an argument and then you're getting ready to write, okay? And when you're writing, your sources are not only driving your argument and driving the fact that you're proving the argument with it, but the sources actually map out your argument and what you are writing, the body of what you are writing. That you are not just using the sources to create an analysis, and you're not just using them to create a narrative, but that you're also using those sources as an organizational tool to map out your argument, to give detail and also to give evidence to your argument. So the sources are your roadmap, right? They help you to put that roadmap together, and they help you to present to your audience what it is that you're trying to prove in your writing. And again, sources, you can't stress this one enough, the idea that you need to give credit when you use sources. You obviously need to cite all of your primary sources, but in giving credit to the people who have written the secondary sources that you are using, you're showing to your audience that you are a professional, that you have professional ethics, and that you also want them to be able to tap into the sources that you've looked at to not only see if your work is on the up and up, but to also give them a new road to look down and a new rabbit hole basically to go down in terms of being able to look at your sources and then being able to delve more deeply into them beyond the way that you've used them in your piece of work, right? So sources really are a significant tool for the historian, and those sources are again driven by synthesis and analysis, and they are what actually drive your argument. So, analysis drives history. It drives historical research. It drives the profession. It's really what we do as historians. It's the main work that we do. And there are multiple things that you have to worry about in terms of your analysis. And one is the reliability of your analysis and proving that you are a professional historian by being able to show to your audience that your work is reliable, that your analysis is reliable. One of the ways that you show this reliability is obviously through using reliable sources, right? Using authentic primary sources, using secondary sources that come from academics and academics alone, unless, like I said, there's another expert that you might be able to consult. But there also is a level of reliability, particularly in your analysis, that you need to rise to, and that is illustrating to your reader, illustrating to your peers that you know and understand the major theories that drive the study of history, and that you know the major methods that drive history. And for individuals who are concerned about their level of reliability, that want to make sure that they um, illustrate to their audience that they are reliable, and they often will footnote their discussions about what methods they use, what theories they used, and also how they arrived at their analysis by using particularly the theories. So there's a way to show that you are a reliable source of history and a reliable source of historical knowledge and analysis. And it's not just through using reliable sources. You really have to prove that you understand the tenets of our profession. Another thing that you have to show in terms of your reliability of your work is that you understand that other people have created work about your topic, and that you put those works, not only do you weave them into your own work in terms of evidence, arguments, but that you are footnoting them, that you discuss them in footnotes, or at least list them in footnotes in terms of books that you have not used for your work, but that you acknowledge are out there, or that you may have looked at as a reference but didn't actually incorporate it as evidence into your work, right? So many ways that you can show you're reliable. Well, it's the same with credibility, right? You have to be a credible historian. One of the ways that you become credible is by having credentials, right? You have to have the PhD. You have to be someone who is steeped in the understanding of history and the tenets of the profession. And that illustrates your credibility. But what also illustrates your credibility is that you know the same things that we talked about in terms of reliability, right? You are credible because you know what sources to pick. You are credible because you know the secondary sources like the back of your hand. You are credible because you understand what the major interpretations are of your topic. You are a credible historian because you have not only learned all of the tricks of the trade and the tools of the trade, but that you use them, and that makes you credible. And your credibility also comes with your expertise and the length of time that you have been using that expertise, right? That you show that you are credible in that respect. But there's another way to show credibility, and that is to have reasonable arguments. You don't want to have logical fallacies in your arguments. You don't want to invalidate your own argument, right? The fact that you have sound reasoning, the fact that you have sound methods and you have sound theories, the fact that your analysis is plausible, the fact that your analysis is footnoted, and it's not just footnoted in terms of being able to cite properly, but footnoted in terms of having a discussion about the profession, or a discussion about theory and methods, that illustrates to people that you have a solid, reasonable argument. You have written something that illustrates to your audience that you are somebody who should be listened to, right? Having that solid argument, having good organization, having a cohesive argument and body of work is really what illustrates to people that you are a professional historian and somebody who should be looked to not only for historical knowledge, but also for evidence. And one of the ways that you set up a good argument is by understanding the issue of causation, right? That every single event, every single issue that occurs in history can be caused by one particular thing in terms of a necessary cause, and multiple other things in terms of a sufficient cause, right? So we've used the example of the Civil War, right? The Civil War being caused by the issue of slavery. That's the necessary cause there. Slavery has to exist in order for there to be a civil war, right? But your sufficient causes are going to be states' rights issues. Your sufficient causes are going to be the election of Abraham Lincoln. Your sufficient causes are going to be racial theories and ideas of white racial superiority, right? All sufficient causes to lead to the war, but none of them would be there without the necessary cause of slavery, right? So you have to, when you are writing, when you're analyzing, when you're creating an argument, and when you're writing, you have to deal with causation over and over again. And you have to make sure that your understanding of causation is logical. If it's not, then obviously your argument is not going to be logical. The work that you're writing, the A to B to C to D in your writing, is not going to be logical, and it's not going to be credible, and therefore your work will not be reliable, okay? So I can't stress this enough, the idea that analysis really drives what we do. And if you're good at it, and if you cite it properly, and if you are good at setting up an argument and following through on the argument and providing evidence for the argument, then you have won the battle of becoming a historian that is accepted within the profession as someone who is absolutely steeped in what it is that we do and actually has the expertise to perform it. So, what is the point of knowing everything that we know about the profession of history and studying history if we don't understand the value of it, right? And I know that for many of you within this course, you don't need to see a broader value because you enjoy history, you love history, and you're someone who wants to study it and wants to maybe even become a professor because you enjoy the act of learning about history and you enjoy the act of discussing history with others, right? But obviously, we need to prove our importance to people. And as historians, sometimes that's a very difficult sell, especially because many people don't necessarily like history. I know, shock of all shocks, right? Some people don't actually like history. Um, but so it behooves us to understand what our value is as historians. And one of the major things that I always think about are our contributions. And of course, this is something within our profession that is something that we're supposed to do, right? We're supposed to contribute. We're supposed to create arguments and conclusions, and then hopefully have those arguments and conclusions become incorporated into the historiography. But it's our contributions. It's really what makes us of value within our profession. That we have um, researched and analyzed a topic and come up with something that contributes to the profession or even society in a meaningful way. And so that to me is the greatest value of history is what is it that you contribute? What is it that you have contributed in terms of your research, right? And there are other ways to contribute, obviously. There are ways to contribute in terms of teaching, which is an immense contribution societally. There are ways that you can contribute in terms of, say, writing op-ed pieces and changing people's minds about a topic, or being somebody who becomes a talking head on television, who educates people about a very timely topic, right? So you can make contributions in other ways. But the main contribution of the historian within the profession, rather, is that you have contributed, your research has contributed in some way to expanding our understanding of history. Another great value of history are the creation of narratives, right? And we talked about the fact that narratives aren't just story driven, that they have analysis within them, and that they are a balance of those two. But the story aspect of the narratives is really important, particularly because of the fact that it's what allows people to enjoy what we do. So our ability to write, our ability particularly to write stories around our analysis, gives us great value in terms of being able to, for lack of a better term, entertain people, right? We have value in the sense that we entertain our readers. We have value in the sense that our narratives illustrate to people an understanding of a topic that they had not had before, and that they can actually carry with them through the rest of their life. And they can use it in terms of their own personal knowledge, but they also can disseminate the information that they have learned from us to other people, right? And that just keeps the chain going and going. Another significant piece of value in terms of studying history and being a historian, particularly, is that as a public historian, you are somebody who is able to reach the public all the time, right? Somebody who works in a museum, particularly, or a historical society, or works as an interpreter, right? Somebody who is always in contact with the public, who is always there trying their best to impart their knowledge and their understanding of history to other people, to make them better understand the world around them, to make them make better choices as informed citizens, right? So there's significant value in that. But I also, as an academic historian, really suggests that there's great value in being an academic historian inside your ivory tower. The expansion of human knowledge is something that gives great value to what we do. The understanding that we will create about the world around us, even if it is laced with jargon when we explain it, that expansion of our own minds and the expansion of knowledge within the academy is so very important, and it creates immense value for what we do, even if those ideas don't always make it out to the greater public, and even if those ideas don't always become palatable for a wider group of people and the public to be able to understand what we're talking about, right? So we obviously have the I don't know if it's the blessing or the curse of the academic historian to be someone who really ponders things and speaks about things in a very intellectual way, but sometimes is very inaccessible in the way that they speak, right? But that doesn't mean that we don't have value as academic historians, even if we're sitting there in the ivory tower. I think that there's great nobility in the expansion of the human mind and the expansion of human knowledge, right? And another major value of history would be the answers that it gives people about their lives, the answers that it gives people about their ancestors, the answers that it gives people about particular topics that would allow them to make better and more informed choices, as I mentioned before. The idea that answers about life itself have great value to the greater public. They have great value to us. They have great value to the people who are reading our work or listening to our lectures. Having more answers and more understanding of the world around you is something that makes a human being more comfortable, and also may propel a human being to a completely different life that they may not have even thought of before. But giving answers to the world around them allowed them to have a switch in their thinking and propelled them to something different, right? So there's so much value in the study of history. And I know I'm preaching to the choir in terms of we all love history in this course. Hopefully, we all love history for taking this course, because it means that you are getting a BA in history. So hopefully, you enjoy it. But it's preaching to the choir, right? We all know that there's significant value, even if none of the things that I have listed here are of value to you, or something that you have thought about already. History has value to us. Like, we enjoy it, right? And we enjoy being historians. We enjoy learning about history. But there's immense value. There are significant contributions that we can make as historians. So, at the close of this course, where do you go from here, right? You already know that you're getting a bachelor's degree in history. So, how do you become professionalized? How do you become more, or get closer to becoming a professional historian? And the first thing that you have to do is read, 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 and stay up on the literature. I always suggest learning about the new books that are coming out on your topic. One way that you can figure that out is by going to New Books on History on Facebook, NB History. I don't believe they have a Twitter page, but they might. I can't remember. But they are. It's a great place for you to see something new that's coming out. And I always learn about other fields, and particularly people who study eras that are, light years um, before what I study, right? I learn about them there. I also really love the New York Review of Books. It's kind of an old tradition among historians to read the New York Review of Books. You can get a student rate on it. It's not too terribly expensive, but it's just a place for you to see, in a much more comprehensive way than New Books on in History, rather, that you it's very comprehensive in the sense of giving you lists of new books, not only in history but also in different other academic disciplines, and even sometimes outside of the disciplines. Say a new book written by a journalist, or a new book written by a former national security advisor or a secretary of state, something like that, right? But it's a really great place to find the most important books that are coming out at the time, at the moment, right? And most important being, culturally and socially and politically. And then I can't stress enough reading historiographies about your topic and about your field and knowing what the canon is. If you have that down, you have a leg up on so many people in terms of your bachelor's degree program. But you are going to start recognizing more this idea that history is about interpretations and it's ever changing interpretations. You will also be able to be well versed in what the profession is putting out there and what is accepted in the profession per a given topic or a given field, right? So I can't stress those enough. Also, book reviews. If you can't particularly afford to buy books, or if you there's too many books out there to buy, which is my problem. I can afford to buy some books, but not all of them. Book reviews are fantastic because they are something that you can look at and find out a quick summary of the book. You can also find out the thesis, which is most important, and you will know the contribution, and you will also know, at least based on the historian that's writing the review, whether or not that they feel that this is a reliable piece of material, it's a credible piece of material, and that the thesis was proven, and that sources were used properly, and all of that, right? So there's a critique element to book reviews as well, but they're great. They're great places to start in terms of research as well, but I suggest them for knowing what's coming out in the field and particularly knowing what the new interpretations are that are coming out. So I can't stress enough: read, and read very specifically. Also, again, remembering the idea of skimming while you read, right? So if you find new books that you are interested in, that you don't have to read them from cover to cover, right? If you have a stack of 10 books to look at, you clearly have to run through them very quickly, and you need to skim them. So practicing those techniques again while you're reading is very important. So really making sure that you're steeped in the profession by staying up on the literature. Another place to go from here is to look into graduate programs, master's degree programs, PhD programs, online programs, brick and mortar programs, and just get an understanding, number one, of what's out there for you, who offers what type of fields. Some places are known for doing U.S. foreign policy. Some places are known for doing medieval history, right? So you have to look into what it is that they really specialize in or have the best scholars. Like say here at ASU, Donald Fixico is one of the foremost scholars of Native American history. So we are considered a great graduate program for you to go into if that's what you're going to study, right? If you're going to study political history, we have a sort of a smattering of people. It was very different when I was getting my PhD at ASU. It's not quite as big of a community, so we're not as known for it anymore. We used to be known for Latin American history. We are known for public history, right? So there are a multitude of graduate programs out there for you to look at to see if what fits right for you, not just in terms of who you could be working with and what type of a specialization that you can get into, but also looking at how flexible they are, because for many of you that's going to be something that you need to think about, is flexibility of schedule, flexibility of the method of delivery, right? Whether it's going to be online or someplace where you actually go and go to classes. There are a few hybrid programs out there right now, but not that many anymore. Then you also, in terms of where do you want to go from here, need to look into jobs. You need to look into what kind of jobs you can get with a BA. You need to look into what level of jobs you can get with the master's, right? The PhD. The PhD being more and more necessary in terms of teaching and especially in terms of research. The MA getting you your foot in the door for public history, sometimes for adjunct positions at particular types of college, particularly small colleges. But the master's degree has its value, right? It has its worth without the you get having to move on to the PhD. And then for BAs, there are a lot of jobs that are out there that are non-history related, but there are also jobs out there that are history related, like being able to be an assistant in an archive, or being able to oh, I just lost another one that you could do. Being an interpreter. So there are many things that you could do with the BA within history. There's also many things you could do with the BA in history outside of history. So those are things that you need to look into. So in the final slide here, we're gonna have a list of some of the most important books that I think you should be reading in terms of understanding historiography, the practice of historiography, and then also understanding methods and theories. So here are some of the best books in my estimation on the study of history and the philosophy of history. Um, the Peter Tosh book that you use for this course obviously explains the study very well, but is very philosophical about history and the study of history. Peter Novick's That Noble Dream is very much like that as well, and the historian's craft can be, but it's very much about the study. I love The Modern Researcher by Barzun and Graff, which allows you an understanding of what it means to be a historical researcher, what the techniques are, what the processes are, which is obviously very important. All of these that I have listed here are great books, some of them more accessible than others. Say Novick's That Noble Dream would be more accessible than, say, Hayden White's The Content of the Form. That's a difficult book. Block's book is not terribly difficult. The historiography book's a bit difficult, but you want to challenge yourself. You want to make sure that you are able to push the envelope in terms of your understanding of what it means to study history. Silencing the Past is pretty philosophical, but Telling the Truth About History is great. It's a very easy read by Appleby, Hunt, and Jacob. Appleby being one of the foremost, and Hunt actually too, both of them being two of the foremost cultural historians, and they really take the profession to task in some ways, and also explain it to you in a bare bones way that you can really understand. So many books out there, and again, I can't stress enough looking into books about your own field, what it is that you enjoy studying, and really again learning the historiography and knowing what it is that historians know about the topic that you want to study, what historians know about your field of study. Okay, those historiographies are so important, and yet very few people actually teach about them. I know that when I was an undergrad, I did not learn anything about historiography. I had one class that was supposed to be about historiography, but did not explain what historiography was. So I didn't actually know that I was doing it, which was a terrible shame by the time that I got to graduate school. And when I got to graduate school, it was clear that I understood interpretation. It was clear that I was a good analytical writer, but that I didn't quite understand the ins and outs of what it meant to be a historian if I couldn't identify what historiography was, even though I knew interpretations about history. And so it put me at a deficit when I walked into my graduate program. And I very quickly learned, because in graduate school it's sink or swim, but it was embarrassing to me, even if other people didn't notice it, it was embarrassing to me that I didn't figure it out during my undergraduate career. And then I realized, wait, that's probably not my job, right? It was probably my professor's job to tell me that. And to be fair, because my degree was from ASU, and it was light years ago when I got my BA, but there were a lot of graduate teaching assistants that were sort of fumbling their way through their classes, which is what happens. And when you go on, if you decide to do this for a living, you will know that you will have great respect, admiration, and sympathy for any of the graduate students that taught you before, because it's difficult. It's really difficult to juggle writing a dissertation, and learning how to be a teacher, and being able to stand up in front of people and discuss history, discuss the narrative, discuss interpretations, and you can be very enthusiastic about it, but you can really enjoy it, but you're also scared. And you also are at a point in your life where you know that you don't know all the things you need to know, and yet you have to teach people. And so it's not a slam necessarily against my professors because they were graduate teaching assistants, but it did put me at a deficit when nobody talked to me about historiography, right? So I want to make sure that all of you know that historiography really is like at the core and the center of what it is that we do as historians. Interpretation is it, right? No cold hard facts. Like, we are looking at interpretation all the time, and that's why history changes so much. And I want you to be able to understand that you can be someone who creates new interpretations. Your original research that you do, some of you will do this as an undergraduate. You certainly will do it as a graduate student and as scholars. The original research that you do, the interpretations that you make, they're important. And they have a place in the profession, and they may even make their way into the historiography, right? So it's really the lifeblood of what we do: interpretation, analysis, and the creation of that canon of ideas, or the historiography, right? So I really hope that you've enjoyed this course. I hope that it's enlightened you on what it means to be a historian. And I hope that you have been able to get a greater understanding of what it is that you want to do as a historian once you move forward from your bachelor's degree. So again, I really hope you enjoyed the course, and I hope you learned what it is that you wanted to in the course. Okay, take care.